Thank you, Father Peter, very much. And I want to thank you for everything you do for us every week and all week. You draw the parishioners because of your special talents and your special gifts. It's not only your voice, which is spectacular. It's not just the way you teach us every week. It's not the way you inspire us. But I don't know any human being who manifests more the love of each one of us for our fellow man than you do. And it's those special characteristics that draw your parishioners every week. And I thank you. So thank you very much for coming. The title of this book is Extraordinary Hearts. And I have two meanings for the word extraordinary in this application. The first meaning is that there were spectacular anatomic ailments that afflicted these 10 hearts, about which I tell you in the book. These are mechanical ailments that are extraordinary and required modern extraordinary methods for their correction. That's the first meaning. For that first meaning, I hope that in reading the book, you'll learn a lot of medicine with no drudgery. Just like you for a child, you put the pill in the applesauce, and the child doesn't know he has the pill. By the time you finish this book, you'll know a lot of cardiology, but I hope you will have felt no pain whatsoever in acquiring that knowledge. The second meaning that I have for extraordinary has to do with the heart inside, the spirit. And these cases demonstrate courage, and they demonstrate perseverance of the human being that I'm describing. And I chose these cases out of, I don't know, Lorena, maybe 8,000, 9,000, 10,000, who knows. I chose these because they were 10 that moved me the most, moved me myself the most, and made me grow the most as a person by virtue of taking care of these individuals. What I'd like to do in 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes, is tell you just a few words about each chapter and share with you some of the special characteristics that these individuals manifested and what made me grow by caring for them. You may wonder, what business do I have showing a picture of these children playing soccer? Well, I want to tell you the story of Emmy. And I was minding my own business. I had finished a big operation. I think I was having a yogurt, Lorena, in the 5 minutes that I have for myself between my duties after the operating room. And the call came, they need you right away in room 21. I think it was you, Lorena, who called me. And you said, there's a hole in the heart. They need you right away. So I dropped my yogurt. I ran. It's about 400 or 500 yards from my office to the operating room. I ran over, and I went through the door, and it was like a scene out of MASH. Most of the audience, I'm sure, remembers MASH. And there was blood everywhere on the walls, on the floors. The drapes were scattered. They weren't even on the patient. There were 30 people maybe, and mass hysteria. And it was clear that everything had gone awry. I didn't know the patient. I didn't know what was going on. I had no clue. With all those people there, nobody even noticed that I had come in the room, and so I worked my way up to the table. My colleague who was operating saw me right away, and immediately he took a sigh of relief just knowing that an experienced colleague was there to help with whatever had happened. And nobody would tell me exactly what had happened, but I could see that the patient was essentially gone. There was no organized rhythm of the heart. There was no blood pressure. The anesthesiologist was shouting, "You guys are losing blood faster than I can give it. I can't keep up. She's gone," was the last thing that he said. But I figured out from the comments that were going around that a tragedy had ensued. The doctors were putting a trocar, that's a sharp metal tube with a pointed end. They were putting that under the breastbone to put it into the chest cavity and biopsy a tiny little nodule in this patient. I had no idea if the patient was a woman, a man, nothing. The initial preparation of the skin was just the size of a postage stamp, but now all the drapes had been pulled away, and the doctors had made a big incision to try to fix her heart. That trocar had gone astray and gone right into the left ventricle, the main pumping chamber of the heart, and torn a hole in the heart just like a bullet would do. And that's why the heart had lost all its blood, all the blood from the body, and it had stopped beating. And the doctors had tried to put a couple stitches in it, but you may think of muscle as very strong because our muscle moves us, it allows us to run a mile, lift weights, and muscle is strong in that way, but muscle is very weak in terms of being able to hold a stitch. It's the fascia, it's the sheath-like tissues in the body that are strong to hold a stitch. So all the stitches that the doctors had placed had torn through. So this all seemed very desperate to me. I had no confidence at all that the patient could possibly survive, but I was there to help a colleague, and we put her on the heart-lung machine right away. It took about 2 or 3 minutes. Once the patient is on the heart-lung machine, it doesn't matter how much blood is lost because it goes right back to the machine, and that allowed some blood to flow. And we gently lifted the heart and saw the jagged cut. And then we put some stitches in, my colleagues and I didn't have much hope that they could hold, because every time a stitch had been placed and torn through, the hole got bigger and bigger. But we did that, and then I dropped the heart down, and I didn't expect it to hold at all. It started to hold, and there was no more blood coming out. And then I didn't expect the heart really to be able to start up. But little by little it resumed a heartbeat, beep, and a late beep, and little by little the beeps got more frequent, and that was a step in the right direction, but that's a far cry from the heart being strong enough to actually pump blood. So little by little we loaded the heart, we let some of the blood stay in the heart rather than go out to the machine, and the heart started to pump it. And the anesthesiologist was administering what we call rocket fuel, in other words, the most powerful tonic medications that we had to try to squeeze any remaining ounce of strength out of that heart. And with the rocket fuel, we started to see a little blip in the blood pressure. And you know your blood pressure should be at least 100 or 120. We saw 50. And then a few minutes later, we saw 60. And then a few minutes later, we saw 70, 80, 90, and 100. So we had been able to restore a blood pressure. And it's the only time in my life that I've never lifted a heart to examine the repair, because I didn't think that the heart would even tolerate lifting without those stitches tearing through. So it wasn't my patient. I didn't know anything about the patient. And I left at that point, and I let my colleague who had started the operation go ahead and close up. I never expected the patient to survive to leave the operating room or get to the ICU. And I went about my day. We did our office hours. And then I made my rounds, and I went home. The next morning, I'm in early making my rounds, and Barbara, one of our nurses, she pulls on my sleeve, and she says, "Doc, Mrs. Solomon wants to talk to you." And I said, "Barbara, I don't have a patient by the name of Solomon. You've got the wrong doctor." And she said, "You better come with me." She said, "She knows you. She's been to your house." I had no idea what she was talking about. Barbara's very, very clear, very bright. I thought she was just confused. I walk in and I see a woman who's not only alive, but off the respirator, and shouting, "You know me, John, hi." And she said, "Thank you." And I had no idea who it was or what she was talking about. It turns out she was the lady who was on the table the night before. Not only had she survived, she'd come off all those tonic medications. She had been able to have the breathing tube removed, and she was awake and fully cognizant, which is incongruous with not having had a blood pressure for all that time. And she says, "It's me. I'm Emmy Solomon. I taught your kids. I've been to your house." She kept saying that she's been to my house to convince me that we really had a link. And it turns out that she had taught my children. She was a revered teacher in the junior high and was loved by everyone. And she said, you don't know this, but your family, when your kids graduated, they gave me a Swarovski crystal angel. And she said, "Yesterday afternoon, I knew you were in the room, and I saw that angel above me, that Swarovski crystal angel." Of course, I didn't know what my family had given her. And it was just an absolute miracle. She's still alive now, 6 years later. That biopsy procedure was being done for a metastatic cancer, a cancer that had already spread, but she's still alive. And in the chapter, I use the word miracle. Miracle, the technical definition is events that can't be explained by the normal rules of nature. And I think that fits. And you can put whatever connotation you want on that, but the rules of nature, by the rules of nature, she should not have left the operating room. She should have been infected because there was no sterility. The heart should never have worked, and she should never have woken up and been cognizant. Now, this picture here, I think that this woman survived because of who she was. She and her husband, they have nothing of their own, nothing. And they have dedicated their lives to the street children of Sao Paulo. Her husband lives there a year long. She goes down every summer and spends 3 months there. Her kids have worked there. She adopted one of the kids just like her own from that school. And they take street kids from Sao Paulo who would die otherwise, be on drugs, and they teach them, and they give them a profession, and they give them a future. I get choked up just talking about it, and a life. So I think Emmy survived because she and her family have dedicated their lives to others. I don't think there's a better religious principle than that. And that's how I think that miracle was wrought. And I start with that chapter in the book, which for me is still, you can tell I get choked up just talking about it. What I'd like to do now is just tell you a few snippets about some of the other chapters and show you a picture or two. Some of the patients that I'll tell you about are very famous, and I'm sure you know their work. Others are ordinary people like us. So this is a letter thanking me from Dave Brubeck, certainly the greatest jazz composer of our lives. And I love music. God gave me not 1 ounce of musical talent. He gave me all the love with none of the talent. And that's the reason why when my former secretary told me that Dave Brubeck was coming in to see me for an operation, I said, "Who is that?" And I think I was the only one who didn't recognize him walking down the hallway of the hospital. But I was walking the other way, and I saw this tall figure with shock of pure white hair in a pantsuit. And there was a tremendous energy coming from him, and you could tell the love for his wife who was walking beside him. Just watching this man walk down the hallway, I said, well, that must be him. This man has a tremendous energy. That must be the man that my secretary was telling me about. And of course, he composed Take 5. Everybody knows Take 5. Blue Rondo a la Ronde. And just a revered jazz musician. He created all kinds of musical measures that had never been done before, of extreme complexity. So he was coming to see me for blocked arteries in his heart. And I put that in because blocked arteries are one of the most common problems that afflict Americans from middle age on. And this was 27 years ago. We did his bypass operation, and that stood him the rest of his life. He never had to have another procedure, another invasive test or anything. The bypass operation is such a wonderful operation. I describe it in the book in some detail. So in this case, I feel like my profession allowed me to stand next to greatness, to someone to whom God had given an extraordinary gift. And he died just a couple years ago. About a year or two before he died of old age. About a year or two before he died, he was honored at the Kennedy Center. You've probably all watched the Kennedy Center Honors on PBS. Once a year, they honor 3 or 4 extraordinary individuals. And he was honored, and I was watching. That night, I was watching live on TV. And he is such a humble person that the only time in the whole ceremony that he got emotional, and I knew him well enough to read it in his eyes, and then the tears came, was not when he was being lauded, when he got the great Kennedy Center honor, but when they pulled a little ruse on him. When they contacted him originally, they said, the only thing I want, please let my 4 sons play some of my songs. as part of the ceremony. And they said, it's impossible, Mr. Brubeck, for reason A, B, and C. Meanwhile, they were planning that behind the scenes. So as a complete surprise, he's sitting in the stands, and his 4 children came up and played a medley of his hits. And you could see the pride and love that he had, and then the tears started to flow. So that's the very special man that Dave Brubeck is. Besides his extraordinary talent is his humility. And the only thing that moved him at this greatest of all honors was really when his children got to play his music for everyone on TV. So I'm very proud to have that letter on my wall. This is an incredible story. This is from the New York Times. This is 23 years ago. It was a frigid winter day, and a van drove off I-95 into the frozen Connecticut River and went under the water. There were 2 parents and 3 children, ages 2 to 7. Just at that time, there was a Navy diver driving the same highway, and he saw the car go off. And there was a retired New York policeman. These people stopped their cars, got out of the car, and jumped in that cold river and submerged themselves to try to save that family. Under the water pressure, the doors wouldn't open. And one of those men took his fist, and he broke through the sunroof. And he put up his hand in, and an ankle came out. And he got the first child out, and that child was revived. They couldn't get the others out quick enough, and they all died. They were all frozen, no pulse, no blood pressure, unconscious. But the ambulances brought them to our hospital. And they said, can you revive these people? We had just finished, this was 3 o'clock, we had just finished the big operations of the day. We had 4 empty operating rooms. My colleagues and I, we put all 4 of them, the 2 parents and the 2 children who hadn't been revived, we put them in the operating rooms. We didn't really know what to do, but it turns out we all did the same thing independently in all of those operating rooms. We right away put them on the heart-lung machine to circulate blood and oxygen, and we warmed them up. It took about an hour. We have a big heating machine in the heart-lung apparatus. And lo and behold, every one of those hearts started to beat. And every one of those patients left the operating room and went to the ICU. Now the 2 parents continued to on to death, ultimate death, but the 2 children survived. Now they weren't normal. They had cognitive deficits and they had motor deficits, things they couldn't do physically. And they went to rehab. I got 1 report at a week, and they hadn't made big progress, and that's it. You know, I didn't expect anything. I thought, well, we did what we could. And then fast forward 23 years, my former secretary, not Lorena, she calls and she says, Doc, I think you're going to want to take this call. She puts through a call, and there's a young woman, and she says, Doctor, you operated on me 23 years ago at Yale Haven Hospital. I want to know what you did. It turns out it's that little girl. She's alive, well, she's talking, she's working, she's normal. Imagine that. And she was dead at the scene. And she says, my brother is in the armed forces in Iraq defending his country. So these are 2 lives. I was flabbergasted. These are 2 lives that were lost. And were it not, it was my boss at that time who said, let's put him into the operating room. It was my boss who made that decision on a split second's notice to try what we could. So this story is very moving for me because these are lives that were done. And because of medical technology and my boss's willingness to try something bold, very bold, there are 2 young people now who are leading productive lives. And this is the story that was written in the New York Times about the daring rescue in the frigid river. You know, we use the cold a lot in the operating room. This is an article that appeared in the BBC magazine. I like to call that my office. I know yours is my office, Lorena, but I like to call this my office. That's where I spend every day. And we use the cold deliberately. I'm going to show you some patients that we deliberately freeze for their operations. I love the colors in this drawing, all the blues and the whites. There was a young man who was raised in rural Oklahoma. They didn't know the word at that time, but he had dyslexia. And they told him that he was stupid. And he had physical ailments, so he couldn't play sports. In the Midwest, if you're a young man and you can't play sports, that has a big impact on your self-image and your self-worth. And this was in the late 1940s, early 1950s. It turned out he was born with a narrowing in his aorta, the main artery of his body. The young man found that he had one talent. He could really draw. And he told himself, again, I get choked up just thinking about what he was feeling then. He told himself, I know I'm not stupid. What can I do to build my self-worth? I can really draw. So everybody who needed a banner, everybody who needed a cover came to him. And he developed a reputation for that. Then he could no longer get by because he couldn't breathe. That narrowing was preventing the blood from reaching his lower body. So in 1964, he had an experimental operation by Dr. Beatty, one of the leading cardiac surgeons of the time. And Dr. Beatty removed that narrowing and put an artificial aorta in. And he was doing fine the next day when a very alert resident came by to make rounds on him. He looked at the drainage chamber and the blood was pouring out the tubes from this young man's chest. And he tells me now, Mr. Miner, that he could tell he was losing consciousness. He thought it was just the drugs. And the stitches had given way, and all the blood was pouring out into the drains. That resident took him to the operating room on his own initiative. He hollered for blood. The attending surgeon came in, and he was saved. He came to see me at the age of 62 when another heart problem had created an enormous aneurysm in his chest. And again, he couldn't breathe because it affected the valve. The ethical issue here was that from that first operation, he had contracted hepatitis C. Okay, it's a terrible disease, but he kept it, by mind over matter, he kept it under control. But then I had to, of course, he needed this aorta operated on, but I had the ethical problem of, do we operate on this man and expose our whole team? This was 10 years ago. There was no treatment for it. Expose our whole team to a lethal virus. It kicks it up a notch that my professor died of hepatitis C that went on to cause liver cancer that he got in the operating room from a patient. So this is an ethical issue. I told him, sir, I'm going to call you back. I don't know. I'm going to think about it. And I thought about it. And Father, I came up with really, there's only one decision. You have to do it. And I talked to my team about it, and we used the highest precautions. So anyway, we replaced all of his aorta, and he survived. He's doing well. Now there are drugs that can treat the hepatitis C. And he went on. He invited me to University of Connecticut when he received an honorary doctorate. His name is Wendell Miner. Think of this. Now, this is the young man who had been told he was stupid. Turns out he had dyslexia. And he got an honorary doctorate degree for his incredible accomplishments in American art. He's probably the #1 most respected contemporary American artist. He's written 200 books. He's made the covers for over 2,000 books. And if you just go to the bookstore, look under Wendell Miner, you'll find very moving pictures like this. This is Carmela. She is patient #1 in our aneurysm database. I met her. It was one of the few times that my wife gave me complete responsibility for my kids. They were about this high. And she never gave me complete responsibility because I could get called at any time. But I don't remember where she was, but I remember it was a Saturday. I was out shopping with my kids, and I got a call from Carmela's doctor, the best cardiologist at our medical center, and he was very calm, and he said, "John, I need you right away in the emergency room." And this young woman's aorta had burst. She has Marfan disease that you may have heard about, like Abraham Lincoln, very tall, very thin, and the arteries burst. And he felt especially bad, my colleague, the cardiologist, because her husband was a Yale professor. And he'd followed her, and this had befallen her. So we operated on her urgently, gave her a new aorta, and she survived. And it turns out her husband is a professor of epidemiology. He knew everything about handling numbers. Our team knew a lot about the aorta, and we said maybe someday we'll write a paper together. Now we've written 157 papers together in the last 20 years about this disease. And this was Carmela's 20th anniversary of her emergency operation. That's her painting. She's a still life artist. She's gotten quite well known. Her Marfan's disease took the vision in her right eye from birth. So she does these incredible three-dimensional drawings with one eye, unocular vision, and without real depth perception. We've gotten to be very good friends, and this was at our celebration for her birthday. I tell also the bad outcomes in this book, so you get a sense of the whole scope of what we do. There was a classmate of mine who was the first one of our class to die. Tall, lanky kid, big Coke bottle glasses. Any of you would recognize if you walked in the room now that he had Marfan disease. Nobody knew about it then. It wasn't even a known diagnosis. He was always a bit of an outsider, very bright kid, but nobody really fraternized with him because of how funny he looked. Marfan patients have funny faces. We call it faces, the medical term for the shape and appearance of the face. And about 3 months after we graduated high school, we learned that he had died in a motor vehicle accident. Of course, a Marfan patient, the aorta can't take any accident at all, so his aorta ruptured right away. And I was called to take care of a patient who looked just like my friend from high school. Same age, 17 years old, ruptured aorta. I was called urgently. We replaced his aorta. He survived. And he was like an idiot savant. And he had a whole portfolio of his drawings, like this drawing of the White House. Very, very moving drawings, different perspective. It turns out that he didn't have the connection between the right and left brain. It was absent from birth. And he had this unusual perspective and this artistic ability. So we saved him. Over the next 9 months, the aorta in his belly grew to 17 centimeters. It should be 2. And one of my colleagues and I, we operated for about 13 hours, and we couldn't save him from that, and we lost him on the table. And it was the first time that my wife had seen me cry, probably since we had been married. We had tried so hard, but it can't always be done, and I tell those stories in here too. The most prolific author of all time, Robert Ludlum. His books are still at the airport, even though he died about 10 years ago. I was called to take care of him first for a coronary bypass. He was a drinker, smoker, womanizer. And we did that many years ago, and he was kind enough to dedicate one of his books to our team. Fast forward 15 years, they're calling from Florida. They want to ship him up. One of the valves, all our bypasses, all 4 bypasses are fine, but one of the valves is worn out. And they say, by the way, he smokes so much that his lungs don't work, and he's on the breathing machine. Well, that's almost, that makes it almost impossible to do open heart surgery. But we brought him up. It's the only time in my career I've ever written a pre-operative obituary. You see, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to operate on Robert Ludlum. You know, there's no way this man can survive a second operation on the breathing machine, alcoholic. And I want to have a prepared statement, you know, to explain how bad he was, because he's going to die on my watch. Thankfully, he survived. He came off the breathing machine, and I was able to tear up that one-page pre-mortem obituary. And he actually died about 3 years later. I thought it was due to medical causes. But his nephew called me, a physician, and he said, Doc, his wife killed him. And there's a huge lawsuit going on. He had sold 200 million books when I first operated on him. Now it's probably 1 billion books, and he's still selling them every day. There's a huge fortune involved. His wife of many years, even though he womanized, and when he left the hospital, the nurses told me, the limo met him, pack of cigarettes, a fifth of Johnny Walker Black, and his girlfriend. But he really loved his wife, and that was his only confidant, really, and she died. He was so lonely that he married a gold digger several years later. Everybody told him she was a gold digger. And there's evidence, and I put it in the book, what the nephew provided to me. The nephew wrote a book about it, that she set the house on fire knowing that he wouldn't be able to get out, and he died of complications of the burns that he suffered on that day. And it's all in litigation now. But again, this is another time when I was standing next to greatness. And it was Mr. Ludlam who would talk to me. I'd go sit on his bed each day, and he would talk to me, and he encouraged me to write my first fiction. He said, Doctor, a professional writer may be able to craft more easily than you, but the professional writer, to write a medical mystery, has to go out and have somebody teach him the medicine. He said, Doc, you know all the medicine. He said, just do it. And that motivation led me to that. Just 2 more stories. This man here, Bill Vinovich, he's number 52. You can see him on TV every weekend. He's one of the 14 head referees in the NFL. 52-year-old guy with the loveliest family. The family's very parallel to mine. 2 children, 1 boy, 1 girl, same ages. And I really identified with this man when he came to see us in the office. And the secretaries and nurses all loved him. Very charismatic, handsome man. Everybody fell in love with him. He was a high school tight end, not quite big enough or good enough to play in the pros, and he became a referee. And he's about the best referee anybody has seen. 4 years before he came to our office, he was lifting weights, and his aorta tore. The description that weightlifting can tear your aorta came from my office based on other patients that we'd seen like this. And his was in a location where it was just treated by lowering the blood pressure, and he survived. But the NFL took him off the field. They said, this man can't play, it's not safe. So he came to our offices, and he said, Doc, I can't live my life without doing what I love to do. He said, I'll absolve you of any responsibility, get me back on the field. So we replaced his entire aorta, the ascending, the arch. We reimplanted all the branches to his brain, to his arms. We did this in a deep freeze. We cooled them down. It's not quite frozen. We call it a deep freeze because they're very cold. And to work on the arteries to the brain and the arms, we have to stop even the heart-lung machine. Not only is the native heart stopped, but also the heart-lung machine. And we did that, and he did well. He's been back on the field now. This is his 3rd year. Watch him every Saturday, every Sunday, or Monday or Thursday now with the other games. And he's number 52 on the back of his jersey. And when he got back for the first game, the announcers on NBC paid a special tribute to him for his fairness and his abilities, and they were so happy to have him back. If you remember the playoff game, I'm seeing some nodding in the audience. The playoff game 3 years ago in Denver, 10 degrees below zero, 1 mile high, went into 4 overtimes. The 4th longest game in NFL history. He was the ref. I was watching in my living room. I was sweating bullets because it's a perfect storm. High tension. Okay, what else could you have that's bad for the heart? High altitude, so there's no oxygen, and a temperature of -5, -10 degrees. All the arteries just constrict. It was a perfect storm of adverse factors, and I kept telling my wife, Peggy, I don't care who wins. I wanted to get back into the locker room. But he's reffing again this season, doing a fantastic job. And just watch his decisions like that so you can see how well the cold preserves the brain during that 1 hour that there's no circulation. He makes perfect decisions just like that every time. And then look at this man here. He won every event in this Olympic competition. It's not the ordinary Olympics. He came to me with his heart failed. He lived the longest. He lived on an artificial heart, the longest any American had lived at that time. 5.5 years. We could not find a heart to match him.